Welcome to Mercy Haven's compliance training. Today's training will be led by Janelle Moran. Janelle is Mercy Haven's compliance officer, and she's a licensed clinical social worker. Janelle?
Thank you. So today we're going to talk about the compliance program. In 2009, the state had decided that all providers that bill $500,000 or more in Medicaid need to have a program set up in order to make sure that there is no fraud, abuse, or waste within the Medicaid billing. So one of the things that we put together was a compliance program that incorporates audits, trainings, things like that, in order to make sure that we are meeting the requirements. The Office of the Medicaid Inspector General is the state agency that facilitates this program and make sure that we are meeting the requirements. On the slide, you'll see contact information for the Medicaid Fraud Hotline, the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General, because we definitely believe in transparency. So if at any time that you felt that you needed to report something directly, we're giving you that information. We have nothing to hide. We will talk later about different ways that you can report to myself, the compliance officer, the director of human resources, or even encourage you to speak to your supervisor if there was anything that you felt made you uncomfortable or you weren't sure about. Because one of the biggest things with the compliance program is about reporting things so we can investigate them. We never want something to come up that we didn't know about and then have an outside agency find that information when we should have known. So it's very important to us that we are investigating situations as they arise. Even if you're not sure if it's a problem, better to bring it to the individuals that I just named in order for us to see what's going on. With the next slide, we'll look at Mercy Haven's compliance program. There are 8 elements that the state requests that we have. The first one is written policies and procedures. We do have several compliance policies that are available in each department. You're encouraged to take a look at them. And if at any time you have any questions about them, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I can be reached by email, telephone, stop by my office. But the policy and procedures, we lay out what is required that we need to do within Mercy Haven. There is the compliance program policy that really lays out all the things that get done in order to ensure that we are meeting the state and federal guidelines. Another requirement that they have is that an employee has to be invested into the day-to-day compliance program operations. And as we said in the beginning, that would be myself, Janelle Moran. The next one is training and education of all affected employees and persons, and that's what we're doing today. I need to make sure that you're well aware of all the requirements that you need to adhere to in order to follow the agency's compliance program so we can be compliant with state and federal laws. The next one has to do with communication lines to the responsible compliance position. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of ways that I can be reached through telephone, coming to my office, through email. And we also have an anonymous hotline that I'll go over later in the presentation, where if you weren't comfortable speaking to myself directly or the director of human resources or your supervisor or any other senior level director within the agency, you can put an anonymous report, and I will get back to that a little bit later. The next one has to do with disciplinary policies to encourage good faith compliance program participation. So it is the expectation that all people follow the compliance program. And if you are found to not be following the requirements of it, then there can lead to disciplinary action. The next one has to do with the system of routine identification of compliance risk areas. One of the biggest things that I do, and I ask other departments to assist with as well, is do audits. We're looking at different ways to make sure that we're meeting the requirements when we're billing, because we don't want to have a situation where an issue has occurred and we didn't know about it. So we do a lot of audits and a lot of oversight in order to make sure that we're following the regulations. The next one has to do with the system for responding to compliance issues as they arise. One of many policies that we have has to do with what we do if we find a problem, which would include things like investigations. I would be working with the director of HR in order to look at what has occurred and how we need to address it. Mistakes happen, but also things are done intentionally. And so we're trying to make sure that there isn't an issue that has come up. And if there is, then how would we handle it? And that's done through investigation, whether it be speaking directly to staff or looking at things like documentation. And the last one, a policy of non-intimidation, non-retaliation for good faith compliance program participation. We're really encouraging people to step forward and to be involved and to speak up when they have concerns, even if you're not totally sure if it is an issue. And the results of that will not be that you'll be intimidated or retaliated against for speaking up. We strongly believe that if somebody is bringing an issue forward, that they will be protected. Those issues can remain anonymous. They are definitely held in confidentiality. So it's very important that people come forward and don't feel that they're going to lose their job or have any issues based on that. The next slide is just a demonstration of the various policies within the compliance program. As I mentioned before, there's a compliance program policy that captures many different aspects of the compliance program. And then from there are other policies that go into more detail. One of the things that we've created is a compliance program work plan that is very similar to the compliance program policy. And the work plan is available on the agency's website. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. And it lays out all the details of what kind of audits are being done, what we're looking for, what our expectations are in terms of having a functioning compliance program. And if you take a look at that and you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Just to highlight, as we already mentioned, I am Mercy Haven's compliance officer. One of the things that the state is requiring is that there's somebody who really is visible and is involved with developing the program and making sure that the day-to-day operations of it are functioning. One of the things we have at Mercy Haven is a corporate compliance committee, and the committee is made up of both board members and agency directors. And what the committee does is ensure that there's oversight of the compliance program. We bring different audit results, the code of ethics and business conduct, and other things to this committee to make sure that there's oversight. So it's not just the directors or myself who's guiding the way that the compliance program functions. It's also board members. So one of the things that we have to have is a code of ethics and business conduct. And what that does is establishes the way that we're supposed to be behaving while at work. It's guiding principles for acceptable behavior with respect to employees, board members, and those that are also working with us. It's a commitment to meeting regulatory guidelines and things like that. Within that is the conflict of interest policy. And that's important because we do have contracts and we do set up work with other vendors that there could be financial gain for somebody. So we have to make sure that, let's say, a board member doesn't own the landscaping company that we're contracting out with to have at all of our facilities. And if they do, they have to be transparent about that. They can't encourage us to work with somebody and not let us know that there would be a financial gain for them. So that's very important and something that, we definitely look for transparency on. The next thing that I'll go over has to do with our exclusion list. And that's something that we check upon hire and then monthly to make sure that somebody isn't excluded from working within Medicaid. There's a state and federal list. There's actually 3 of them that we have to check. Because if somebody were to, let's say, steal Medicaid dollars or get involved in something that they shouldn't have within the Medicaid program, there's a list that they're put on then that says that you can't hire them. So we have to make sure that we're not hiring those individuals, because if we do, then we can have a lot of problems, especially if somebody in our community residences were to provide services to an individual that we then bill for. If they were on that exclusion list and we didn't pick up on it, we would have to give all that money back. So it's very important that it's something that we look at on a regular basis. Medicaid billable programs is the next section we're going to talk about. We do have several programs within our agency. Some of them we bill for and some of them we don't. And of the 2 that we're billing Medicaid directly for are our community residences and our home and community-based services. The other programs like supported housing, we receive money to provide services to an individual, but it's through a grant. So while we still have to make sure that we're meeting regulations, we're not billing per service like we are in the other programs. Just to give some background information, we have 3 community residences that can have up to 34 individuals living within them. And with those individuals, not only is there money being paid for rent, we're also providing them with monthly services to help them to learn how to be more independent. The way that billing works for Medicaid and the community residence is that you have to provide services 4 times a month to get a full month of billing. And if you provide any less than the 4, you can only bill for a half month. So it is something that is important that the staff are providing what they can when they can. Home and community-based services are a new thing that we're providing within Mercy Haven, and they're very similar to what we provide in the community residences, with the idea of trying to help somebody to maintain in the community. So it might be different life skills, coping skills when they're having symptoms, how to take care of their home, things like that. And we're also providing supported employment services similar to our supported employment program. So that's the other piece with the home and community-based services. Documentation and billing is very important because if we provide a service and we don't document it, we can't then bill for it. So, one of the biggest things that I will do when I'm doing audits is to make sure that we have the documentation to support the service that was provided and billed for. One of the things that we look at are service plans, which outline what the person is working on within the service. Progress notes describe the service that the person is receiving, and the authorization for services that a psychiatrist will provide is that prescription to receive the service within the community residence. All those items have to relate to the community residence. There is a service plan and progress notes related to home and community-based services as well. It just plays out a little bit differently. But it's very important that we have that prescription from the psychiatrist or the managed care organization as it relates to home and community-based services to show that there was approval in order to receive the service. We can't just bill without it. Fraud, abuse, and waste is the next section and is really the heart of what the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General, or OMIG, is focused on when they are requiring us to have a compliance program. The idea is that somebody within the organization should not be developing a scheme or committing fraud in order to obtain money or property that they shouldn't have and getting that from a healthcare benefit program like Medicaid. Sometimes there is abuse and waste, which are not as intentional, but it's where services are being provided that, let's say, the person doesn't need. So you're overutilizing a service that is more costly. The idea that a community residence is going to cost a lot more than supported housing. And if somebody is not medically needing that program, then we should be moving them on. So that's kind of the idea. But the big thing really is about fraud and making sure that services are being provided. We're not billing for services that the person didn't receive and things like that. And that's where the documentation really comes into play and is really important to show that the service was provided. So the next slide we're going to talk about has to do with fraud against the agency. And while this isn't something that OMIG is necessarily looking at, it is something that we look at for the compliance program because it's important that we're making sure that we don't have staff members who are using their position for things like financial gain or even getting items. We have had situations in the past where staff have put schemes together of, let's say, taking cash from residents and not documenting that properly. So then they're stealing from the residents and ultimately stealing from the agency if that money was supposed to come to the agency. Or even staff members who go food shopping and buy themselves dinner for that night on the agency's money, using the agency's money. So that's obviously not something that we can have happen because it's hurtful against the agency, and it's also not the kind of things that we obviously would want our staff to do. So it is something that we're always looking at. We do make policy changes and systemic changes based on those kind of things that we might find. So it is a part of what we're looking at. And if you become aware of something like that, that's definitely something that you want to bring to your supervisor or myself or human resources. So the idea of waste, I've already mentioned, it's when practices are insufficient, which then causes higher billing to the Medicaid program. There's often not intent, but it is something that we need to check for to make sure that the services somebody receiving is necessary, that we're not looking at a higher type of service like a CR, like I mentioned, when somebody needs much less. So how do we prevent fraud, abuse, and waste? And some of the things that I have listed here are perform record reviews. As I mentioned, I do a lot of audits, but so do a lot of the supervisors and the directors. We're checking to make sure that everything is documented and that we're not doing something that we should. We're not billing or documenting something that we shouldn't. And, it continues by saying conducting regular internal audits. I will be out doing audits in addition to others to make sure that we have everything that we need. We also implement written policies and procedures and make changes as needed, like I mentioned before. If we're seeing something that's not working or that we have to strengthen a system that we have in place, we're going to do that if we find problems during audits. We conduct training and provide education, and that's what you're sitting through right now to make sure that you are aware of what is required and what we're looking for as an agency. We report suspected instances of fraud, both on a staff level and higher up. If anybody were to find a problem where they're seeing fraud occurring, whether it be internally through the agency or even in Medicaid, that's something that we would have to report. And we review payment notices for errors. So one of the things that we look at, myself and even the finance department, we're making sure that there isn't errors in billing. I'm checking billing reports, and the finance department is also checking to make sure what they're putting in to have claims towards Medicaid is accurate and there's no issues. So the next thing we're going to talk about has to do with what they call overpayments. And this connects to what we're talking about in terms of doing audits, doing internal reviews. When we find that we've received money that the state would say that we shouldn't have, that we're not entitled to, they consider that an overpayment and they expect that we pay it back. So if I find an issue, let's say in documentation, that we don't have enough to support the bill that went into Medicaid, that's considered an overpayment and we have to give that back. And that is something that I work with the finance department on as it comes up. So this slide shows examples of when we're not entitled to keep Medicaid dollars. As I mentioned before, if we find errors in billing or even documentation, that could be an example of when we're not entitled to the money that we billed for. So for example, if we have billing for a service when a progress note for that service wasn't written, we can't keep that money if we don't have the progress note. Billing for a service that was not included in participant service plan. This has come up before, and along with the progress note example, somebody's providing, let's say, a medication service, but there's no medication service within the service plan. We can't keep that money that we've billed for. Or even if we don't have a valid authorization for the restorative service, which relates to the community residences, we can't bill for services that was provided to that person. Another one has to do with the false claim. If, let's say, a progress note was written and a service wasn't provided, that's something that we're then not entitled to that money. And that also becomes, issues in terms of fraud that we would definitely be looking very closely to. But if a progress note is written and it's false, then that's definitely a problem. The other thing that we would also look at is the exclusion list, which I mentioned before. If somebody was providing services and they were on the exclusion list, that's not then money that we can maintain if we billed for it. So all these things are looked into, and if we determine that we have money that we're not supposed to have because of, error or intentional, we have to do what they call a self-disclosure. And this is when we're basically giving the money back. If it's a small amount of money, adjustments can be made in the finance department. But if it's a large amount of money, over $5,000 or more, we have to then go through a process of disclosing that information to OMIG and basically letting them know what it is that we found, how we found it, what systems we're going to put into place so it doesn't happen again, and things like that. We have had to do that before. We had a self-disclosure of over $50,000 that had to do with those authorizations for restorative services because unfortunately the doctor wasn't filling it out correctly and it wasn't meeting the regulations. But because we took it and were using it, it didn't matter that it wasn't filled out during the correct time frame. We still were held responsible. So it was something that then we reported back and we had to give money back for. So there's some relevant laws that dictate what we're doing in the compliance program that, it's important that we make sure that we let you know about and we're required to do. So the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005 required Medicaid programs to look for fraud, waste, and abuse, similar to the way that the compliance program was established in 2009. It pretty much started with the 2005 Deficit Reduction Act. We don't bill $5 million a year or more in Medicaid. So we're not fully under this, but it does bring forth things like the False Claims Act, which I'm going to talk about next, which we do closely monitor. So the False Claims Act is basically what it sounds like, a claim in part or whole that is false or fraudulent. And it's important to understand that whether you have knowledge of it or have done it or have disregarded it, it's still something that we're supposed to be looking out for and we should not be doing. Because even a supervisor who says that they didn't know anything about it, if they should be monitoring what's happening, they can fall under this issue as well. So it's when somebody's submitting a false claim or they don't reverse an overpayment, as we mentioned before, that also falls under the False Claims Act. And the last one has to do with the anti-kickback statute. And this is an example has to do with if somebody knowingly or willfully offers, pays, solicits, or receives anything of value to induce or reward referrals or items or services paid in whole or part by the federal health care program. If we had, let's say, a doctor that kept asking for referrals and in turn was giving the agency or the individual that they were working with, let's say, tickets to a ball game or cash or things like that, that has to do with the anti-kickback statute, and it's not something that we can do. And this is also considered fraud because there was something influencing the referral and the services that were being made, and that's not allowed. So all the acts that I just mentioned and statutes and regulations are being enforced by different agencies. And there's a whole bunch of them that you'll see on the slide: the Office of the Inspector General, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Justice, things like that. So it's important to understand what these regulations and these statutes and these laws are so we don't fall into them. Taking a kickback, even if it's something small, is not allowed. Submitting a false claim or ignoring the fact that a false claim was submitted is not allowed. And that's something that's not allowed both internally by our agency, but also by the law. And it's something that could result in somebody being brought up on charges. So, you have to keep that in mind because we are billing Medicaid. We are taking state dollars to provide these services. Next we're going to talk about has to do with participating in the compliance program. And the question I always ask is, who's responsible for reporting issues related to the compliance program? And the answer is everybody. It's everyone in the agency, board members, whoever has knowledge of an issue really needs to be reporting it and letting us know, because we can't do things if we don't know about it. Participating in the compliance program, the way that we do it are things like reporting potential compliance issues, not participating in behavior that can result in Medicaid fraud, abuse, or waste, knowing or abiding by applicable laws and regulations, striving for accuracy and excellence in service, coding, and billing, assisting in the investigation of issues and self-evaluations and audits of ourselves, of each other. So those are some examples of what we need to do. So to continue, participating in the compliance program, if you become aware of issues, as I've mentioned several times before, it's important to report them. So as a compliance officer, you'll see on the slide, I've provided my name, my telephone number with the extension, my email address, and also know that I work at the main office. So if you ever wanted to pop in, I'm here as well. And you could always report issues to me if you have questions or concerns about anything that's going on. So one of the things that we look at is called a whistleblower. And, that's somebody who is coming forward to let us know that there's an issue, because myself, human resources, the directors, we don't necessarily know everything that's going on. It's important that people bring those issues forward. And a whistleblower is a person who exposes any kind of information or activity that is deemed illegal, unethical, or not correct within an organization. There are protections for whistleblowers. The idea is that you will not be retaliated against if you come forward and let us know that there's a potential problem. And, when you're coming forward, the expectation is not that you have all the information and know all the answers. It's that something's not seeming right to you. Even if it's just that gut feeling, if you have a question, if you have a concern, it's very important to bring it forward so that we can look into it. One thing that we offer at the agency is something called a compliance hotline. It is monitored by myself and Human Resources, and it's an anonymous and confidential hotline that can be used by anyone. There's a website where you can provide information. There's also a telephone number. And the way that it works is the Lighthouse company is the third party that would take the report from you, whether it be on the website, through email, or through telephone, and they would then provide that information to myself, Human Resources. We both get the information, because if one of us happens to be the focus of the complaint, the other person then would be taking it over. So don't assume that just because Human Resources and I are monitoring it, that if it goes to us, it may just be left behind, because, we have to cover all bases. So we cover each other as well. One of the things we offer at the agency is a compliance hotline. It is a system that is monitored through a third party called Lighthouse. And what they do is they offer different ways to make a report. There's a website, there's a toll-free number, there's email, there's even fax. And what a person can do is they can use any one of those different options and put a report in if there's a concern. And it could be a very minor concern. It could be, I have concern about a situation that happened at my job, my office, whatever it may be. However it has occurred, maybe there's a concern about something that's happening with a resident. You would provide that information, and Lighthouse would review it, and they would send a report to myself and to Human Resources. And from there, based on what the issue is, we would begin an investigation. Sometimes investigations occur together, where both Human Resources and compliance are involved, and sometimes it's one or the other. So it really depends on what the situation is. But what Lighthouse offers is a way for you to remain anonymous and also to have the information stay confidential. They provide us with a report and for a way for us to ask questions if needed. The best thing I can say is when they're asking you to provide contact information for them to get back to you, to please do so. It's not for us to know who you are, but it is our ability to be able to ask questions if we need more information. If you choose to tell us who you are, that's great too, but you don't have to, and that is an option that you have. So when you look at the slide that says Compliance Hotline website, you'll see that this is what it looks like if you were to use the online option of Lighthouse. And it gives you the opportunity to submit where it says report an incident. And then if you've already made a report, it gives you an opportunity to go in and to see if any additional comments were made or questions were asked, because that's our opportunity, myself and our human resources, to be able to speak to you, but through Lighthouse. The next slide has to do with Mercy Haven's website, and a lot of work has been done to make this a lot more user-friendly and provide a lot more information. And if you go on the website, you'll see that we have a corporate compliance program page that provides information, contact information for myself, different information about the compliance program, and also another way that information and concerns can be submitted. So that's something that if you haven't looked at that part of the website, I definitely encourage you to check out. The next slide about external reporting is just, again, phone numbers and contact information for the Office of the Inspector General, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, or CMS. We're not trying to hide anything. We're giving you as much opportunity as you can. If you have concerns about Medicaid or how things are occurring within the agency or even outside of the agency, it's good information to have. We always encourage people to come to us first so we can try to handle it, but that doesn't mean that that's the way that you would choose to go. The next part has to do with investigations. As I mentioned, as we get reports, whether it be somebody sitting in front of me telling me that there's an issue, or we get something through the compliance program hotline, an investigation would occur. We're trying to make sure that any situation that's being reported is addressed. And when we have the capability, providing information back to staff about how things were handled. We can't always report everything because we do have to protect the confidentiality of other staff members as well, or other, people involved in these situations. But when we can, we will be reporting back on how situations were handled. Keep in mind that just because you don't see something immediately happen doesn't mean that it didn't happen. But myself, with the help of human resources, other directors, we'd be looking into the situation that was being reported on to see what occurred, to see how we need to handle it, if policies need to be changed, if systems need to be changed. That's what we would do. And finally, there are times where disciplinary action has to occur because maybe individuals haven't followed the guidelines of the compliance program, haven't reported issues, or have been involved in behaviors that go against the compliance program, as we've discussed, or failed to be a part of the process of investigating and have refused. And there are times where that could lead to disciplinary action that could go as far as termination. It's not what we want, but if individuals are doing things that go against, let's say, the code of ethics or how we expect the behavior within our agency, then it could lead to that. And that would be the outcome of the investigations like I talked about before. So that is the main focus of the compliance program. If at any time you have any questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to give me a call, reach out. Even if you have questions about what you've seen in this presentation, I'm available.
Thank you so much, Janelle, for all of that really great information. And I know in this forum, it can be difficult in terms of having questions and having those questions answered. Obviously, there's not a person in front of you to answer those questions, but we do want to encourage you to just give Janelle a call. You can ask her any questions that you have, big or small. And, we want to make sure that you get the answers to the questions that you have once you've taken this training. Now that you have taken the training, please make sure to sign the attestation. No credit without an attestation. So you're just going to sign off that you've watched this video presentation all the way to the very end. So sign that attestation and get that back to Human Resources. There is also a compliance assessment that we would like you to take. And it's just to make sure that we're checking your understanding of the information that you received. And so it's not just checking your knowledge, but it's also checking to make sure that our presentation did convey all of the information that we needed you to have on this topic. So again, thanks for your participation, and please let us know if you have any questions.